Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ramblick and welcome to this particular podcast. We've got a lot of people focused on politics at the moment and leadership, given we've had the coronavirus pandemic and a range of other issues that have put politicians front and centre. But in putting politicians front and centre, it's caused some of us, including my guest today, to think about what we were observing, why we were observing it, and why the behaviour of certain individuals in the political system is what it is. Author and journalist Sean Kelly had penned a fairly insightful volume on the Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He's called it The Game, and he joins me today to talk about the way in which he sees the Prime Minister, or key themes that emerge, and perhaps looking at the way in which people can decode what politicians more generally are doing. Sean, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
It's an absolute pleasure. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Now, there are two words I need to ask you about first before we go into touching on the broader themes that I notice you've been playing with and analysing. Why call it The Game?
There is an analysis in there of the ways in which politics has become a game for many people. And politicians are the main class of people there. I think there is a very large extent to which many politicians treat politics entirely in terms of winning the next election. Now, of course, there is some justification for that. Winning an election is a very important, the most important mark in the political landscape. Winning an election brings with it power and the ability to make changes in line with what you believe the world should look like. It is obviously very significant. The danger comes when you forget that your actions have consequences outside of their political consequences. They have consequences for real people in the real world that have nothing to do with your chances at the next election. And so I think politicians fall prey to that. And I think journalists, to a very great extent, fall prey to that. It's not a new observation that a lot of journalism treats politics like a horse race, like a type of contest. And that is the case. I think that's become increasingly the case in recent decades. And then I think we have to admit as well, Tom, the complicity of many of us with that framework. A lot of us tend to approach politics as a game as well. I don't think we would admit that to ourselves, but we often, many of us look at politics in terms of tactics, in terms of strategy. We stand back and we really admire politicians' cleverness. And I think often that political cleverness is elevated above questions of substance. And I think that's a real problem.
You've made several key observations there, and I want to start breaking them down just a little, tease them out.
Okay.
In terms of, you talk about the objective being winning elections in order to obtain power. When you've been in your writings over a long period of time, and certainly in putting the book together, do you observe that there is any example or any sense of the pursuit of power for its own sake?
I mean, absolutely. And look, this is a tricky area because I think that ambition drives a lot of people in life, and often, and I don't know exactly where that comes from, but ambition is often devoid of purpose as an initiating impulse. People want to achieve something in life, but I think for many people, with the course of their life as they grow older, they realise that unfocused ambition is a fairly empty thing. That actually they need to fill it up. They need to have meaningful aims. They need to achieve something for the sake of what is being achieved, not for the sake of a title or the prestige. Whereas I think politicians often operate in the opposite direction. They begin with some idea of what they might want to get done, and politics slowly saps that out of them. And that's not excusable, but it is understandable in the sense that every environment that anybody works in has a dramatic influence on the people who are working in that environment. Eventually, you become your environment. And once politics has once it ticked over into that sense of being played as a game above any other concerns, it was inevitable that the people who entered politics would begin treating it that way as well. So if you're a new politician, you're elected to Parliament tomorrow, and you go into the Parliament, probably you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but when everybody around you is treating politics in terms only of the election, it's a very hard force to resist.
What you've said leads to another observation, I guess, and that is someone's entry into Parliament may be driven by virtue, but they walk into a caucus or a party room and it turns into a game of snakes and ladders.
Yes, absolutely.
In that you take, if you're in Labor and you're a part of a faction, you may end up taking one step forward, two steps back, depending on factional fortunes and negotiations and ministerial appointments. Goodness knows what else. If you're in the coalition, it might depend on who your best mate is or which prayer group you attend in Parliament. So all of that seems to play out, and in that respect, where do you take when you take the observation of the media that you've made, which is the media is swept up in this ecosystem, for want of a better term. How do you deal with this performative? How do you put the brakes on the performative nature? How do you discipline the subject? Or is there too much performance happening at once, and that kind of thing doesn't work? We see them constantly. That is, the politicians in front of a camera. How do you stop them from being that performative and bring them below that sort of layer of frozen ice on a lake, if I can use that analogy?
How can we as a society do that? Or
how can we? Well, let's start with the media first.
How can the media stop politicians from doing that?
Yes, precisely. The media is the first port of call, surely.
Yeah, no, you're right. Look, it's an incredibly difficult question. There's obviously a complex play between the various elements involved. When television came along, I think it's worth briefly going back in the past. When television came along, that began to change politics. It didn't happen immediately, but it happened pretty fast. In my book, I write about a book called The Selling of the President, 1968. I guess it was a time of lots of violence in politics, but at any rate, The Selling of the President. And it was about Richard Nixon's failed 1968 campaign. And it focused on television advertising. And Roger Ailes, who would later go on to head up Fox News, is quoted at the time, a young man at this point, saying, "This is what politicians will be forever after. They will be performers." And he was right, of course. And that has become more and more true. And of course, what starts as an observation begins to be to seep into the very marrow of politics. And over time, politicians have become more and more skilled at performing. And alongside their greater skill at performance, what's happened is that we have become more and more accepting of the idea that this is what politicians do. And journalists as well have become more and more accepting of that. So it's a very difficult process to reverse. I'm not sure that the media can necessarily reverse it, but I suppose part of the answer to your question would be that there needs to stop being a simple acceptance of performance on its own terms. The fact that a politician says something, the fact that they performatively act a certain way, doesn't mean that that has to be presented unmediated to the public. And to take Scott Morrison, it was remarkable the extent to which his performance of a rugby league loving, once a week curry cooking man was communicated to the public. He did it in this enormously contrived way. He held a press conference in his first week holding a rugby league ball. He gave his first television interview as Prime Minister to a rugby league star. He mentioned Go Sharks in radio interviews without any context whatsoever. He just slip it in there at the end. It was this contrived performance. And I think what often happens with the press, and this is harder perhaps when you're talking about television or radio, certainly when they're live, but what happened in parts of the press is those things that Scott Morrison did were simply passed on to the public, as though the press is simply a window, with Scott Morrison on one side of it and the public on the other. But that doesn't mean that the image is important. It doesn't mean that that's the most important thing about Scott Morrison, simply because he has chosen to communicate it. And Scott Morrison is just an example here. I think that sense of unmediated passing on of whatever a politician happens to want to present has become a problem with time, and it's become a problem with time because politicians have become better at performing. 50 years ago, it made sense. 50 years ago, a politician was performing less, or at least in a less skilled fashion for the cameras. And so in some sense, the public would get a sense of what was actually going on, what that leader was actually doing. But now politicians know what they have to do. And so if the press simply accept that and pass it on to the public, then, that has all sorts of implications.
But the thing that happens, in this situation, is someone then says, "Oh, well, Morrison barracks for the Sharks." Oh, okay. Albanese barracks for the Rabbitohs.
Yeah.
And what's that got to do with the price of fish, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, my power bill, my water bill, but the Sharkies, right? Yeah. It is so disconnected with the very thing that people out there worry about.
Yes, and of course there's going to be some element of, who are these politicians? What are they interested in? Fair enough. There's no, I try to say in my book, we can't be completely righteous about these things. They're inevitable to some extent. The problem comes in the degree of it. As you say, Tom, they're not connected to the price of bread. And if we focus on them to the exclusion of important and complex policy issues, that's when we all lose out. And that's absolutely what has happened.
But the other thing that happens when you enter into that space where Annabelle Crabb enters into, which you will recall the episode, you probably watched it more than once with Scott Morrison, where she asked him about media criticism. And he says that he's learned not to care about it. There's an interesting phenomenon that's emerged from that moment, which is people on social media have turned that moment and that one line into a meme.
Yes.
So there's something else that's going on here as well. When you've got people within the community who've turned around and said, "Oh, he's used the words, I've learned not to care." Well, I think that I'm being precise, but I may be paraphrasing. And that's become the meme.
Yes, yeah, and it's misleading. It's
in its own way,
and I think that happens a lot on both sides of politics. And Look, this is absolutely part of the issue. I think what politicians have learned to do over time in their political communication is less and less they try to persuade people. More and more they try to provide their supporters with a set of talking points that those supporters can then use. And then you essentially see, and you can observe this on social media, people with opposite views talking past each other, and they're not really interested in a dialogue. Now, I'm not damning social media as a whole. I don't join with those members of the press who want to entirely, write off various parts of social media. But there are problems with it. Of course, there are. And certainly that sense of people speaking past each other and potentially misrepresenting what politicians have said simply to reinforce what they already think is one of those problems.
It certainly is. I interviewed Chris Uhlmann some time back now for this particular podcast series, and he explained to me the origin of his tweet, the sewer rat stuff. Which was he wasn't so much concerned about himself, but the way in which his colleagues were being treated by people on social media.
Look, and some colleagues, some members of the press are treated absolutely atrociously, mostly women, often people of colour, and it's horrific. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what sparked his. I don't think Uhlmann believes.
I don't remember the exact tweet, to be honest.
There was a tweet one morning. He comes up and he sort of said, "Top of the morning, sewer rats," and it spawned people, and it spawned a whole raft of people on Twitter saying, changing their little profile titles to sewer rats and everything else. So that tweet ended up having a life on its own. People sort of taking it and owning it. Hey, I'm a sewer rat on Twitter. But the point Uhlmann was making in terms of the way in which Twitter can Twitter users can use it to dehumanize or discriminate or put down, and in some respects to with no cost to themselves, which is interesting. Whenever you write a major piece of work, you start somewhere. And it's not usually where you end up and the finished product that the reader sees. Where did you begin with the game? What was the first thing you started belting down? Where did you start with it?
Well, the real starting point came in 2018 when I was approached by the editor of the Monthly, Nick Fight, to write a long profile of Scott Morrison. He'd just become Prime Minister at this point, and nobody really knew much about him. And so I gathered everything I knew about him, gathered everything there was on the public record, and I talked to a bunch of people, and kind of sat and stared at these facts for quite some time. And there wasn't anything very clear, because the thing about Scott Morrison is he's avoided talking about what he believes. When he says he believes in one thing, he'll often contradict himself not that far after. His language is often very general. So it was quite hard to tease out consistent strands. And it was only after quite a long time that I realised that was the key to the piece. The key to Scott Morrison's public definition was the fact that there was no definition. He was a leader, he was a politician defined more by absences than presences, and you had to look very carefully at those absences, at the way he had very deliberately left no trace over time. And so that was the start of the article, that the start of the book, really. And actually, it's quite nerve-wracking writing a profile of a Prime Minister who was a relatively unknown quantity when they just begin that job, because you think, well, I could be proved entirely wrong very, very fast. But luckily or unluckily, depending on what you're privileging there, with perhaps unluckily for the country at times, I was was proven largely right. I mean, he has remained a man who does not want to leave much of a trace, a man who does not want to be clear about his beliefs. So I've been surprised at how well that article has stood up.
The way you describe it, Scott Morrison, or the way you describe the process of analysis, is a bit like looking at it's a bit like examining a piece of music. You listen to the music, and then if you're musically inclined and you're trained, you pull up the sheet music, you look at the notes.
Okay.
The silence is just as important as the actual notes that are played.
I see. Yes.
Right. And that becomes a part of that. That becomes a part of the analysis of character from what you said to me. That what is said is is equally important as what is not said, or when silence occurs, if you like.
Yes. No, that's absolutely true, and that has remained the case throughout Scott Morrison's prime ministership. I mean, in a greater sense, of course, the silences are important to look at in any prime minister's career. The things that they choose not to focus on are just as important as the things that they choose to focus on. The reason that those things are essential to understanding Scott Morrison is because they are the dominant fact about him. There is nothing clear that he wants to do. There is nothing very clear about him. And one of the odd things about writing the book is that when I started, people were quite bored with him, and people couldn't really understand why I was writing this book, and the idea that anybody would ever want to buy this book shocked people, and the idea that I had to spend all this time with this man shocked people. But by now, people are actually quite fascinated by these absences, by this oddly enigmatic man, and it's been interesting and very fortunate, but it's been very interesting to watch that transition across the time that I've been writing this book.
There's when we spoke earlier, we talked about the community being complicit in politics. We know the media is complicit. The media is a part of that environment, and we've contemplated perhaps just a little as to how the media could inoculate itself, to use a sort of infectious diseases friendly term, given we're still in a COVID pandemic. How do you inoculate the media needing to think about that? But how does the community deal with this? Because they're at the same time as being the people who vote once every 3 years or thereabouts for their local member, and which translates into the ultimate champion in the leadership. What does the electorate need to be thinking about as we go into another spate of electoral sort of propaganda, which is going to happen soon enough?
I think one of the things that can be difficult in getting people to think deeply about politics is the idea, and I completely understand where this comes from, that individuals can't make that much of a difference. And of course, that can be true in certain ways, but I'm a big believer that cultural change is the strongest force in politics, and that does ultimately come from individuals slowly, bit by bit, person by person, shifting. And I think that as a community, as a society, we need to shift our approach to politics of accepting the idea that politicians are performing, because as I was saying before, there was this increase in the skill of the performances the politicians put on. And I think what that has meant over time is that politics has become distanced from reality. And we accept that. We watch what a politician is doing, is performing, and we say to ourselves, well, they're just doing that because it's a good political tactic. It's not necessarily what they mean. It's not necessarily what they believe. I think at some point those distinctions have to break down because they operate as an excuse. If we always tell ourselves that a politician doesn't really mean what he or she is saying because they're just playing a game, then we stop holding them accountable for the consequences of their actions. And so I think what we need to do is work very hard to remember that politics has consequences, that you might be privileged and largely walled off from the consequences of political decisions, but many Australians aren't. And in the long run, facing crises like climate change, pandemics, intensity of the refugee crisis, the change in global order, none of us are immune from the very real consequences of political decisions. And so we need to learn to think about politics again in terms of substance. Look, the last 3 years it's obviously a very odd period, and COVID has driven a lot of concerns off the front pages, but I'm not sure we were that focused on them before COVID hit. I mean, Scott Morrison's government has obviously been distracted by COVID, and that's to some extent a reasonable defence to how little the government has done. But it is worth remembering that from the time of Scott Morrison's election in May 2019 through to January or March in 2020, virtually nothing was done. And I don't think that people were immensely frustrated by that. And what concerns me is not that people aren't angry at Morrison's government. That's, people will make up their own minds. What frustrates me is that we as a community are not frustrated when a government doesn't do anything. Governments should do things. Governments should look at the problems around Australia and figure out what needs to be fixed and set about fixing them. And there are lots of problems. And increasingly Australia is falling behind in fairly important ways in education, in childcare. The OECD table that showed Australia coming last on vaccination circulated very widely. But we are also down the bottom of lists when it comes to childcare, when it comes to school education, when it comes to climate change. We are doing pretty badly across a range of areas. We are a rich country, a peaceful country. We have an incredible health system, but various things are deteriorating, and we have to try to remember that ourselves, that politics is important.
One of the phenomena that concerns me, and this is probably a convenient segue into wrapping our conversation up, which could go on all afternoon, trust me. But you'll probably get sick of hearing the sound of my voice. But the thing being, there is something that is certainly obvious on social media, and your reflections on this would be useful. And that is, when people seek to inform themselves about politics, they tend to exclude certain sources of information, whether it be a News Limited publication or Sky News or whatever, and they say, well, I stick with this because I see that as reliable. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you believe, and we're both talking from the privilege of being politically aware, engaged in reflecting on this system as part of our work, to what extent do you believe that also harms people's ability to engage in the civic duty of being aware and also holding a government to account?
The narrow casting of media?
Yep.
That's a tough question, Tom. It's a tough
I
question.
thought I'd put it to you because you've answered everything else quite brilliantly.
You're too kind.
No.
where to start with this? There is obviously a broader crisis in media. The broader crisis in media is tied to money. Journalistic outfits have less money than they did. There has been a set of trends in the news over the last 20 years which are problems in various ways. But the greatest one is the lack of money. And what that has meant is that cheap news has rocketed up the charts as far as news organisations are concerned. That means that breaking news is given preference. That doesn't mean it's important. It just means that it's just happened. Very easy, cheap way of filling airtime. Doesn't require any investigation. It also means that huge precedence has been given to opinion, because opinion is relatively cheap. Now, I'm an opinion columnist. I've benefited from that. So no moral high ground there. But in terms of news organisations, it means that more money is spent on opinions than it is on investigative journalism.
Is that, apologies for interrupting the flow. Is there a problem with journalists as celebrity rather than journalists as interrogator creeping in there as well?
Look, difficult to say. There have always been celebrity journalists. It's just they used to be on television and now they tend to be on Twitter. I think there probably is a breakdown of the barriers that existed to some extent between opinion and news reporting. And I think Twitter has definitely been a factor in that. Mm-hmm. Australia has never been as good at keeping that barrier up as certain places overseas. I think America, they treat that division between news and opinion as more important than we do, mm-hmm. Which I think is partly a question of size. We have fewer people reporting and opinionating. Now, all of that adds up to the fact that news organisations are under immense pressure, and that therefore a potential business model is to narrowcast in terms of politics. I think that does mean that, well, it means firstly that news organisations in the broad are less likely to be focused on holding governments to account as a general point, as opposed to holding the politicians they don't like to account. And I think it means that, that we, the voters, are less tuned into holding all politicians to account. We are more likely to be consuming news and opinions which support us in holding the politicians we don't like to account. And that is, of course, that's a problem. Very long-winded answer, Tom, I'm sorry.
No, but it's fine. But you landed where I think is a useful point of reflection. We both consume, or we both read. I don't necessarily like the term consume. We would both read all sorts of stuff. Mm. One of the things that I consciously do is suggest to people that they subscribe to different newsletters online, whether it be Sky News, The Guardian, ABC, whatever. So they're getting some sense of different flavours.
Yes. Yep.
Is that something that you think people could be doing just to mitigate that, just hearing that one sound or one kind of theme or one, having one kind of intellectual diet, I think is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to read a range of news sources. What I think is very difficult there is, while it is important to read news from outlets you might not typically agree with, as outlets become increasingly polarized, that does sometimes make their reporting less reliable, and that's a problem. So in theory, yes, I support people reading a diversity of stories, but in practice, I think it's becoming harder and harder. Now, that said, one of the a piece of advice that I read very, very early, I think back at university, was read the news and learn who the names you think you can trust are, not the names that you agree with, but the names that you trust. And I think that remains very good advice. If you are interested in reading about the news and reading about the world and about politics, then you will quickly find the commentators and journalists who you believe give you an honest opinion. Now, that honest opinion might have a political tint to it, but an honest opinion is different from a person who is always trying to make the facts conform to their vision of the world. That's when news gets into trouble.
And that's a convenient place to sort of wrap things up. Sean, where can people get hold of a copy of the game?
Look, it's available in all bookstores. I recommend going to your local bookstore. You can also get it online at the Black Ink INC website, or anywhere you would buy a book, really.
I got mine via iBooks. I can confirm that the iBooks version works and downloads perfectly.
Beautiful.
Sean,
Thanks so much, Tom.
Sean, thank you so much for joining me. It'd be great to chat to you again at some point.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom.